So last semester we talked about how the Muslims came from the Saudi Arabian or the Arabian Peninsula or Saudi Arabia, and they made their way in a series of many successful conquests all the way through Africa, through North Africa, and up through over here, which here is what we call the Iberian Peninsula over here, which is Spain, includes Spain and Portugal. So the Muslims came in the early 700s, in around the year 711, they conquered the Iberian Peninsula. So they made it from North Africa and took over gradually from the south up towards the north of this area. Um, and when they came, we talked about last semester how we learned about the Jewish Golden Age of Spain. They introduced a lot of advances, a lot of advanced culture that was not really existent in this area, not only in terms of ideas like science, mathematics, literature, philosophy, astronomy, all kinds of things like that. They also brought different kinds of foods and spices from the areas that they had come from. And almost as soon as there was this conquest by the Muslims, there was a counter conquest by the Christians to try to take back the land. So the Christians, who were beat by the Muslims from the south all the way up north, they started from the north fighting back and trying to reconquer the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslims, and that was called the Reconquista or the Reconquest. So from the north, they made their way southward, fighting against the Muslims, and eventually they did beat the Muslims all the way back down south. It wasn't until, like I said, pretty much as quickly as the Muslim conquest took over the area, the Christians, the Reconquista began. So the Reconquista technically began all the way in the 700s, and it was not complete until the Christians beat out the Muslims completely from the area, and at the fall of Granada, the last stronghold of the Muslims in the south of Spain over here, the area called Granada, the Christians beat them there in 1492, which is an important year for other reasons, as you know. So with the it's important to understand what the political nature of Spain was. So Spain wasn't, just as a side note, just so that we understand what was really going on in this area at the time, Spain wasn't just one big country or even two countries like Portugal and the rest of Spain in this area. It was a bunch of smaller kingdoms ruled by different kings. So you had places like kingdoms like Granada, and you had Castile, and you had Aragon, and you had Navarre, and you had Leon, and you had Portugal also. So that's just important to understand, that it wasn't like one big country, but it was really a bunch of different areas that were ruled by different leaders. Eventually, two people, you may have heard of Ferdinand and Isabella. Ferdinand and Isabella get married in 1469. They're from different kingdoms. They're kind of related, but Ferdinand is from Aragon over here, and Isabella is from Castile, and their marriage begins the kind of unification. They're Christians, obviously, not Muslims, and their marriage begins the unification of the land under Christian rule. And like I said, again, at that time, obviously the Christians were in control of these areas, and they slowly but surely, as this key over here on the map shows, when the Reconquista, the stages of the Reconquista, what they took back from the Muslims. And again, like I said, the final area of Granada was taken back only in 1492. So it took about 800 years, almost 800 years, for the Christians to completely beat back the Muslims and take back the land. What's also important to understand is that while we talked about how, in general, Jews living in the Middle Ages had it better when they were living under Muslims than they did as the Jews did compared to the Jews who lived under Christians, that wasn't always the case. The Jews living under Muslims in the earlier period in Spain, definitely, like we said, was the Golden Age, and in certain areas for a long time that lasted. However, there was a group of Muslims known as the Almohads, and the Almohads they came from North Africa, and they were kind of a radical group, um, radical monotheists, and even more so. Their interpretation of monotheism was somewhat more radical than the rest of the Muslims, um, and they basically were kind of violent, and they conquered this area of southern, they came from North Africa, took over North Africa and southern Spain as well, um, from other Muslims, and were not nearly as tolerant as their predecessors. So, for example, the Rambam, who had lived in Cordoba in Spain in the 1100s, the Rambam actually was forced to leave his home in Cordoba and went to Eretz Israel, and then eventually lived the rest of his life in Egypt, because that's where it was safe. So the Almohads came in, forcing people to convert to Islam or die. And the Jews who lived under their rule, if they did convert, a lot of times the Almohads would suspect them of being fake converts, and they would force the Jewish converts to dress differently. And they were also not very nice to the Christians either, right? Both of them, just like the Christians in the Crusades, considered non-believers to be infidels. So that applied to Jews and Muslims. So the Muslims, the radical Muslims, had the same kind of ideas, where they would call the Jews and Christians infidels, and they would persecute them as well. So Jews living under the Almohads, although it was Spain and it was the Middle Ages and it was under Muslim rule, it was not very pleasant to live under Almohad rule. And it was not the case that every Jew who lived under Muslim rule was tolerated and had opportunities, because under the Almohads, the Jews really didn't have opportunities like that. On the flip side, the Christians, when they began the Reconquista, the Jews living under those Christians in the north, at least at the beginning of the Reconquista, things were actually pretty good. They were pretty similar to Jews living under Muslim rule in the rest of the Iberian Peninsula. It wasn't really until later on in Spain under Christian rule that things got pretty bad, and we're going to talk about that more next time. Or in the next couple of days. But basically in the 1200s and then the 1300s, really, and especially in the 1400s, things got much worse in terms of disputations between Jews and Christians in Spain. And then eventually you've heard, I'm sure, about the Spanish Inquisition, and then finally in 1492 the Spanish expulsion, which was when all the Jews were expelled from this area. There was not a single Jew that was allowed to remain in this entire land, or in the entire country of Spain after 1492. So things obviously under Christian rule eventually got very bad for the Jews living in Spain, but at the beginning they were pretty much tolerated to a similar extent than the Jews were earlier on under Muslim rule. So to recap, we talked about how the Muslims conquered this area from the Christians. The Christians had the Reconquista and took it back. We talked about some of the political nature of how the country was run. We talked about the Almohads and how they were a radical, violent Muslim group that forced many Jews to, convert, to be persecuted, or to leave, like the Rambam, who had left because of the Almohads. And we talked about how sometimes life was better for Jews under Christians than it was under Muslims, which makes things kind of complicated. It's easy to sometimes put things in a box. Life's good under Muslims, it's bad under Christians, or it's good with Christians, it's bad. But obviously, things are more complicated than that.